Welcome, everyone. My name is Donald Fisher. I'm the interim principal here. Welcome especially to those folks who've not been here before. I think there are some new faces. The best thing to know about Green Colleges is it's a venue for many academic events. They happen Monday through Thursday every week, from September through to the middle to late April. And every event is not only open to the public, we are encouraged to come, and they're free. In addition, if you come, sometimes you're rewarded with wine and cheese afterwards. So if you enjoy this evening, which I know you will, think of coming again. My role tonight is simply to give you a sense of the visiting professorship under which Michel is joining us. The Cecil Ida Green visiting professorship, the endowment for that, was first made in 1972. It was made to the University of British Columbia, not to the college. And the idea that Cecil Green had is that the university would be able to bring in outstanding scholars, artists, intellectuals from outside BC to come and not only give a lecture, but to meet across campus a wide range of the community. The first lecture, the inaugural lecture, was given by Gerhard Herzberg, who was a Canadian recipient of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1972. So it has a very honourable tradition. More than 200 Cecil Ida Green professors have visited and been at the university, and since 1993, of course, have been at the college. When the college was founded, then we took over the endowment and have continued to bring in eminent scholars. With that, I'm going to hand over to Renwin, who's going to introduce our guest tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Okay. Good afternoon to those who are with us today in person in the room, and also to our online audience. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. And I'm Renwin Yan, and I teach modern Chinese literature, film, and popular culture in the Department of Asian Studies at UBC. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event featuring Professor Michel Hockx, who is also our Cecil Green visiting professor at Green College this year. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hokkien-speaking Musqueam peoples. Unceded means that these lands were never sold, traded, or given up through treaty or other agreement. The university's location and history requires that we critically reflect on the ongoing effects of settler colonialism and structural racism and question what it means to teach, learn, and conduct research on occupied lands. I also want to acknowledge that today's event is generously sponsored by Center for Chinese Research and Green College at UBC, and special thanks to our colleagues Sarah Ying, Deola, and Heather Markert, and Song Fu, whose behind-the-scene work made today's event a reality. And also, before I introduce Professor Michel Hockx, I'd like to remind you that there will be an opportunity for Q&A after the talk. And I hope those of you who are here will also be able to join us for the reception afterwards. And for the members of the virtual audience, if you would like to submit a question to the speaker, please go to the event page, click the link to open Slido in another window, and pose your question and your comment there. We'll do our best to address them following the lecture. And also please note that today's lecture is being live streamed and recorded. Professor Michel Hockx is Professor of Chinese Literature in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Before he moved to the United States, he was a professor of Chinese at the University of London and the founding director of SOAS China Institute in the UK. He has published widely, both in English and in Chinese, on topics related to modern Chinese literary culture, especially early 20th century Chinese magazine literature and print culture and contemporary internet literature. His monograph, Internet Literature in China, was listed by Choice magazine as one of the top 25 outstanding academic titles of 2015. He's also the author of the book, Questions of Style, Literary Societies and Literary Journals in Modern China, 1911 to 1937. It came out from Brill and republished in 2011. Now it's made available as open access publication. And in addition to numerous academic articles, Professor Hockx also has many edited volumes. I just mentioned a few titles. Women and the Periodical Press in China's Long 20th Century, A Space of Their Own, Literary Societies of Republican China, The Global Literary Field, Reading East Asian Writing, The Limits of Literary Theory, The Literary Field of 20th Century China. And today, we have the privilege of hosting Professor Hockx, who will present his latest work and which offers a fresh perspective on censorship studies. And the work examines instances of censorship in modern China, delving into both the era preceding and following the communist takeover in 1949. And the talk is titled Inevitable Impositions, Censorship and Modern Chinese Literature. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Michel Hockx.
Thank you very much, Professor Yang, for this very kind introduction and for inviting me to come to UBC to have the opportunity to stay at this beautiful college. Thank you, Principal Fisher, for presiding over my visit. Thank you, Sarah and Heather, for the support you provided. And thank you for bringing out the sunshine as well. It's much appreciated. And I haven't even mentioned the cheese and wine yet. So I'm going to talk for maybe up to an hour. It's a bit of a long talk, but I hope you will enjoy it. There's a lot of visuals to look at. So I'm going to just delve right into it. In his study of Chinese cultural policy of the 1980s, entitled The Party and the Arty in China, Richard Kurt Krauss warns his readers not to visualize the relationship between censors and cultural producers in China as Bambi meets Godzilla. I think Godzilla is having an anniversary this year, so I thought I'd put him in there. Censors in China are not just brutes that stamp on their victims, and artists in China are not just innocent, doe-eyed do-gooders. In my own previous writings on censorship, I have so far pursued two somewhat discrete trajectories, which I hope to bring together in this lecture. So this is work in progress. When working on censorship of literature in Shanghai in the 1930s, my focus was on the interactions and negotiations between censors and publishers. When looking at censorship of internet literature during the Hu Jintao era from 2002 to 2012, my focus was on the challenge posed by online literature publishing to the state-imposed print publishing system, and on the various mechanisms employed by the state to attempt to reduce obscenity in online fiction. Here I focused on the subversive force of popular culture and the various creative ways in which netizens continue to produce and consume erotic material despite increasing censorship attempts. Both these aspects of censorship lend themselves to comparative approaches. That is to say, approaches that work against the widespread inclination to consider Chinese censorship as something so unlike Western traditions that it cannot be studied in the same context or understood by the same theories. So let's turn to theory. Most countries, including the PRC, have legal stipulations regarding the exceptional freedoms enjoyed by works of literature and art. Such works can possess redeeming value which allows them to have content that would otherwise be considered obscene, defamatory, blasphemous, or even seditious, although the PRC draws the line at sedition, as is well known. As censorship scholar Nicole Moore puts it, and I quote, "Literature's categorical expression has depended, in courts of law and regimes of regulation, on its ability to differentiate itself from the law's proper object, and the ambiguities at stake have seemed to describe the form as such." In other words, literature relies on censorship for its self-definition. If it gets censored, it's not literature, and the other way around. Older approaches to the study of literary censorship focus primarily on what Moore calls the wronged author or the encoded page, that is to say, on what censors did to authors or how authors outsmarted them with clever writing. This is still by and large how literary censorship in China is written about, if it is written about at all. Most discussions of censorship in the PRC either fail to discuss literature or refuse to acknowledge that literature is censored by different standards. Censorship in China is deemed always to be political, based on standards and methods that are the same regardless of what type of text or activity is considered transgressive. Of course, by denying that Chinese literature can be different from any other kinds of texts when it comes to censorship, such commentators are also implicitly denying that Chinese literature has artistic merit or redeeming value. Its value lies solely in what it can tell us about the political situation in China. This attitude, I will argue later in this lecture, is in itself a form of censorship, intended to uphold a mainstream consensus about how China differs from the West, and when I say the West, please always put it in quotation marks, and how an authoritarian state cannot possibly produce good literature, i.e. literature that can be judged by aesthetic rather than political values. When I say that a certain attitude is in itself a form of censorship, I'm referring not to formal censorship, but to structural censorship. The kind of censorship that is based not on legal codes, but on unspoken rules of social propriety perpetuated by social institutions. It is such an understanding of censorship as embedded in all types of social interaction, characterized as they always are by discursive expressions of power relations, that lies at the core of the modern understanding of censorship, as formulated in the 1990s by an academic movement known as New Censorship Studies. New Censorship Studies drew much of its inspiration from post-structuralist studies of language and power, and often specifically from a truly brilliant article on the topic by the late Pierre Bourdieu, in which he defines censorship as a metaphor for social structures that govern both access to expression and the form of expression, imposed on all producers of culture. And if that's too long of a statement for you, then how about the following? In a special issue of PMLA published in 1994, the late Michel, a scholar of Slavic and comparative literature, gave this insight one of his most famous formulations, and I quote, "To be for or against censorship is to assume a freedom no one has. Censorship is. One can only discriminate among its more and less repressive effects." Around that same time, from 1994 to 1995, a series of 12 conferences about censorship was held at various universities in California, supported by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Getty Research Institute for the History of Art and Humanities, and the Humanities Research Institute of the University of California. 12 conferences in 2 years. This large-scale and impressive collaborative program on censorship resulted in what is probably the most canonical publication of New Censorship Studies, the collection Censorship and Silencing, Practices of Cultural Regulation, edited by the legal scholar Robert C. Post. The title, Censorship and Silencing, shows that much of the debate at these conferences revolved around the question of whether or not some sort of distinction ought to be made between what was traditionally seen as censorship and something larger or more subtle that involves silencing people without necessarily making them aware of what is being done to them. One of the most often cited articles in this collection is an article entitled "Ruled Out: Vocabularies of the Censor" by Judith Butler, in which she offers the term foreclosure for the type of silencing that seems to be the opposite of formal censorship. Certain possibilities for expression appear to be foreclosed to the extent that they can barely be thought or articulated. However, Butler adds that there are, what are in my view, two very important points. First, strict formal censorship and foreclosure are the two extremes on a spectrum that contains a lot of gray area in between. And second, even under extreme censorship regimes, individuals are not mere victims. They are not the Bambis. They are subjects that are being produced by a certain system of or institution, and as such they are never just passive. I just used the metaphor of a gray area in which most censorship decisions and censorship-related negotiations take place. And I think that's a powerful metaphor. The late Professor Jing Wang, in her monograph, The Other Digital China, specifically describes the space for non-confrontational activism in China as the gray zone. And although Professor Wang's study is not a study of literature, I will borrow the term the gray zone as we move forward with this lecture today. So let us work for the duration of this lecture with this hypothesis, that it is reasonable and justifiable to bring the postulates of new censorship studies into contact with modern Chinese case studies, and that it is equally reasonable and justifiable to do that without a priori assuming that the communist-ruled period after 1949 must be seen as wholly different from any other period. Echoing Hockx, we can hopefully all agree that censorship is, at any given time in Chinese literary culture, that it is indeed an inevitable imposition on any kind of cultural production, no matter where, no matter when. So with that assumption in the back of our minds, let's work our way through a bunch of illustrative case studies of modern Chinese literary censorship. Some of these have been described in earlier publications by myself and others, and I'll try to always acknowledge the others when I cite their or refer to their work. Others have been part of my research and teaching in recent years, but have not yet been discussed in published work. Some of them involve outright authoritarian suppression, others are more about structural silencing, and the majority are somewhere in the gray zone. Let's start with this picture. How many of you know who this is? Okay. This is, of course, Lu Xun, widely known as the father of modern Chinese literature, and the author of the first modern Chinese short story, Kuang Ren Riji, Madman's Diary of 1918. So how many of you know who this is? This is Chen Hengzhe, China's first female university professor, but more importantly in this context, also the author of a short story with the same kind of modern features as Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, but published 6 months earlier. Histories of modern Chinese literature, whether written by Sinophone or by Anglophone scholars, either do not mention her or relegate her to a footnote, so as to protect the status of Lu Xun as the founding father. The rationalization is usually that her story was published in a journal for Chinese students in the USA. But that rationalization does not make sense, since the widely acknowledged first modern Chinese poem, Butterflies by Hu Shi, was published in the exact same issue of the exact same journal. The real reason for the silencing of Chen Hengzhe's voice remains unspoken and is likely related to time-honored social structures that prefer for founding fathers to be men. Speaking of silencing women, who is this? I'd be really impressed if anyone knows this. This is Gao Jianhua, who was the editor-in-chief of a libertarian fiction magazine founded in 1914, which featured quite a bit of nudity, but also remarkably many contributions by female editors and authors. The magazine, called Meiyu, or Eyebrow Talk, was in China, in Shanghai. Yeah. Was banned in 1916 at the recommendation of a Beijing-based censorship committee known as the Popular Education Research Association, which had as its task to stamp out immorality and perversion in modern print culture, since it was thought to be harmful, especially to the large numbers of newly literate readers educated at state schools since the 1911 revolution, many of them women. This was a case of straightforward censorship. The committee put Eyebrow Talk on a blacklist. The Ministry of Justice issued an order for it to be banned, and future sales of it were prohibited. Here we see on the left the first page of Chen Hengzhe's short story One Day, which predated Lu Xun's Madman's Diary, but whose pioneering status has been silenced. And to the right, we see the provocative cover of the first issue of Eyebrow Talk, published in November 1914. And here we see the members of the Popular Education Research Association who banned Eyebrow Talk, with a familiar face in the back row. Do you recognize him? Indeed, this is Zhou Shuren, the man who only a few years later would become known as the writer Lu Xun. He was responsible for developing the censorship committee's rules for censoring fiction. Lu Xun's role as censor working for the Yuan Shikai government has long been downplayed or intentionally overlooked. It was known. I didn't discover this, but I did a lot of work on it. It was downplayed or intentionally overlooked to protect his posthumous reputation as a great writer, great thinker, and great revolutionary, in the famous words of Mao Zedong. And even those scholars in China who in recent decades revisited this particular part of literary history focused mainly on Lu Xun's activities without bothering to look at the magazine that he banned and ask the question of whether or not it was actually obscene. At the same time, scholars of modern Chinese women's literature rediscovered this magazine because of its many stories authored by women, which have been studied in great detail now, but without mentioning the obscenity accusations and the nudity content, which remains largely silenced. In fact, since most scholars of early 20th century Chinese magazines now rely almost exclusively on searchable databases of digitized magazine content, few bother to read entire issues of magazines from cover to cover, or even look at the illustrations that appeared in it, and instead focus solely on texts, thereby silencing, censoring, banning from sight the visual content of these publications. Are you still with me? We're only getting started. Lu Xun continued to have a strained relationship with censors throughout his career. In the 1930s, he often complained about his texts being butchered by censors prior to publication. In one instance, he even noted that more than half of his original text had been taken out, leaving the other half incomprehensible, which is indeed a very crude form of censorship. It was also not uncommon in those years to see texts published with empty boxes representing characters that had been removed. Nowadays they call that Coco, apparently someone. Had been removed by order of the censors, an indication of how relatively late in the process the censors intervened and how technically difficult it was for the publishers to reset censored texts. Empty blocks, i.e. blank space inside a square outline, have always been and continue to be a graphic representation of censorship in Chinese culture, and we will come across an ironic usage of this convention later in my talk today. What is also ironic is that Lu Xun's reputation as modern China's greatest writer was in part cemented by the very prominent position his work occupied in the 1935 Compendium of China's New Literature, or 中国新文学大系, published by the established Liangyou publishing house in Shanghai. The compendium, which was used by scholars of modern Chinese literature as their main corpus well into the 1980s, was almost not published because censors in Shanghai would not allow it. the censors demanded that Liangyou publishers would remove Lu Xun's work from the collection, since he was a known communist sympathizer and the Communist Party was outlawed and underground in the 1930s. And Liangyou publishers then attempted to bribe the censor, and the censor helpfully indicated that, you know, I do a bit of writing myself, and I would be positively inclined to your publishing plans if maybe you would consider publishing my work. And why don't you publish it in your most famous series, the Liangyou series? And in a classic example of the battle between political capital and symbolic capital, the publishers refused. They said, bringing out the censor's mediocre work in their flagship series would be too much of a recognition, too much symbolic capital. The censor, whose name was Xiang Deyan, accepted that argument and indicated he would settle for publication in a different series as long as the book came out in hardcover and not in paperback. The publishers demanded in return that Lu Xun's work would not be removed from their anthology. The two sides struck a deal and the anthology appeared. Or so the story goes. And I'm not the first person to tell this story. Scholars have written about this. Many in Chinese and also in English. Lydia Liu has written about it in her book, Translingual Practice. But I am the first person to have corroborated the story. Because when I visited the Fudan University Library in 2010, I found the title of the censor's book publication in their catalogue. And so I asked the people at the circulation desk to bring out the book. And they refused. Why did they refuse? They said, this book has been digitized, go to the database. And I went down on my knees and I said, please, bring out the book. I'm not even going to touch it. I just want to see if it's a hardback or a paperback. And they looked at me as if I'd gone completely mad, but eventually they brought out the book. And I took a picture. And so the story is true. This is the bribe that was given to the censor who allowed for Lu Xun's reputation to be cemented for posterity. I'm slightly oversimplifying, but it's a great story, I have to admit. So what have we seen so far? Acts of censorship and silencing that relate to canonization, to elite bias against supposedly obscene writing, to protection of the posthumous reputation of canonical figures, to straightforward bans, to intricate negotiations between publishers and censors, and even bribes. Now, before turning to a famous and complicated case of literary censorship in Mao's China in the 1950s, I'm going to give you a little rest and a break from literature, and we're going to look at a famous case of censorship of art from the early 1950s. This is not a case I have researched myself, but one that I often discuss when I'm teaching about censorship in China, because it remains such a remarkable illustration of cultural policy and censorship under Mao. The scholar Julia Andrews, scholar of modern Chinese art history, has written extensively about this. Some of you probably know this painting. This is a very famous painting seen as an early highlight of socialist realism in China, a style that was intended to use realist techniques to present optimistic revolutionary messages. The scene here is a very famous one. Mao Zedong announcing the founding of the People's Republic of China on October the 1st, 1949, atop the Gate of Heavenly Peace. And behind him is the newly elected multi-party leadership of the new People's Republic, as well as leading members of the Communist Party elite. There's even a tiny bit of literary interest there as well, because the famous poet and playwright Guo Mozhou appears in the second row. And I would point at him if I could see the screen and figure out how to point, but he's there. The artist, Dong Xiwen, first exhibited this very large oil painting, which had been highly praised by Mao himself in 1953. By 1958, he had produced a revised version, replacing the by then discredited and purged General Gao Gang with a flower pot. So So there's Gao Gang, there's the flower pot. You see? I can do this endlessly. He keeps disappearing. In 1967, at the start of the Cultural Revolution, the artist Dong was ordered to remove Liu Shaoqi, who was previously Mao's second in command and was the most famous victim of the Cultural Revolution. And he somehow managed to, and Liu Shaoqi was in the front row, tall man with white hair, not easy to remove someone in the front row, but he somehow managed to change him into Dong Biwu, who had previously been barely visible in the second row. And he did that basically by sort of changing his face and shortening his feet so that he sort of seems to be a bit further back in the... You see? So that's the 1967 revision. It is said that the artist refused to add another figure, namely Mao's new number 2, Lin Biao, on the grounds that Lin Biao hadn't actually been there when the ceremony took place. Why the artist felt that removing someone from a historical scene was less objectionable than adding someone to it remains a mystery, or a function of the gray zone, or perhaps just another example of negotiation. Further revisions were made later by 2 of the artist's pupils, who actually created a replica of the whole painting. This is an oil painting, right? So rather than make further changes to the original, they made a replica and removed various people. And then in 1979, yet another artist was assigned to revise that replica so that everybody could be put back in. And some sources suggest that they actually did a little bit more than that, and that the previously unrecognizable person in the back row now resembles a young Deng Xiaoping. Although I haven't been able to make that out, but I haven't actually seen the actual painting. I've only seen images of it like this. I know of no examples from the Mao period where socialist realist writers of literature were asked to repeatedly remove or add characters in their stories or novels after publication. But that does not mean that literary production at that time was not also fraught with political issues. And indeed, many discussions about content would have taken place prior to publication. Although nothing would have been published without explicit political approval, writers still ended up being persecuted, not because they published anything that openly challenged ideological guidelines, but rather because those guidelines kept changing. And what was correct in, say, 1957 could be very incorrect in 1958. This is what famously happened to the author Wang Meng, seen here alongside a picture of part of the first page of his 1956 story, The Young Man Who Has Just Arrived at the Organization Department. If you see me shaking in trepidation, it's because the English translator of that story, Professor Bailey, is right there in the audience, and I'm sure will correct some of the details of what I'm about to say. Published at the height of the 100 Flowers movement, when the party invited constructive criticism on its functioning, this story highlights issues related to the behavior of dogmatic bureaucrats, contrasting an older generation of party cadres with the revolutionary enthusiasm of the younger generation educated after 1949. The story was lauded by Mao Zedong himself and was widely discussed after publication, but soon thereafter fell victim to the anti-rightist movement that followed and that clamped down on most of the constructive criticism. Wang Meng was branded a rightist and exiled to the countryside for 20 years, or so the story goes. In reality, as confirmed by Wang Meng himself in later interviews, he was only briefly punished during the anti-rightist movement, returned to Beijing not long after. Then, as the Cultural Revolution started to take shape, he decided to volunteer to go to the countryside himself rather than to await further political trouble. What the story does not tell, but what has been analyzed in some detail by the late Professor Rudolf Wagner in his often overlooked book-length study of 1950s Chinese literary culture, is that Wang Meng himself had actually written the story in a much safer manner, worried that it might be too provocative. but that it was his editor at the People's Literature magazine who made changes to the text without asking for Wang's approval, so that its critique became sharper. The editor also included some hints of a love story between the two protagonists as a kind of hook to draw in the readers, again, as far as I know, without consulting the author. The editor wanted to be provocative, miscalculated his position in the cultural political battle that was going on during the 100 Flowers campaign, and he suffered the consequences, as did Wang Meng. Just as Dong Xiwen's original painting was eventually restored after the Cultural Revolution, Wang Meng restored his original text and published the story again in 1981 under a slightly different title. There are many topics related to censorship that can be derived from looking at these Mao-era cases. One of them being the importance of looking at the role played by editors in the socialist literary system, remnants of which continue to exist in China today. These stories remind us that any approach to the study of literary censorship that solely focuses on authors is always reductive, since so many more people are involved in publishing a literary work. Whereas authors typically get all the credit for works that are published successfully, in most cases it is not the author who is published when works are censored, who is punished when works are censored, but rather the publishers and/or the responsible editor who made the decision to bring the work into the public domain. On October the 30th, 1979, 3 years after the death of Mao Zedong and the end of the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping addressed the 4th conference of the China Federation of Literary and Art Circles, which I will refer to by its acronym CFLAC, a nationwide conference commonly referred to in Chinese as the Wendaihui. The next day, the full text of Deng's speech appeared on the front page of the People's Daily. Towards the end of his speech, he stated, to collective sighs of relief, I imagine, that, and I quote, "The party's leadership of literature and the arts does not mean issuing orders, nor requiring writers and artists to make themselves subservient to political tasks," unquote. In doing so, he redefined the relationship between CCP ideologues and creative producers, which had become increasingly politicized during the first 30 years of communist rule. And he also reintroduced the leader's speech as an important element of cultural policy. Throughout the early 1980s, literary writers and also artists and other cultural producers, as well as scholars studying cultural production, repositioned themselves away from any kind of involvement with politics, focusing instead on aesthetic experiment and appreciation. The censorship apparatus, in line with the new guidelines announced by Deng Xiaoping, generally let this happen, but continued to be wary of any content that could be considered overly out of step with prevailing ideological messaging. Interestingly, what we see emerging in this context in 1980s China is a phenomenon described by the English literature scholar Annabel Patterson in her book Censorship and Interpretation as functional ambiguity. Patterson argues, in relation to literary production in England in the 16th and 17th centuries, that censors, authors, and readers gradually arrived at an understanding, a consensus, that literary works could make ambiguous references to taboo topics, and that censors would pretend not to notice the hidden meaning. Thus, writers were granted what we now commonly call poetic license, and censors were spared having to try and interpret every single obscure expression that might be transgressive or not. Whereas prior to Patterson, scholars of censorship debated the need to distinguish political censorship from any other types of indirect expression when it comes to the need to read between the lines when interpreting a piece of literature. Patterson argued that in that period in English literature that she studied, political censorship was the sole overriding reason for authors turning to ambiguous expression, and that even more importantly, all parties in the process of communication, authors, censors, and readers, were fully aware of the arrangement that allowed them to get away with it, hence the term functional ambiguity. In time, Patterson argues, this type of ambiguity became the model for all literary language until the present day. It's a big claim, but it works quite well for this specific phenomenon in the 1980s in China, known as obscure poetry, or 朦胧诗. The enormous popularity of this type of poetry, especially of the 1985 anthology pictured here, is undoubtedly related to the fact that poets like Beidao created ambiguous or obscure images and phrases that everybody sensed to have some political meaning, but that was enthusiastically celebrated without overt political debate. Over the course of the decade, the awareness that this type of ambiguity would be permitted in poetry continually strengthened and even survived the 1989 crackdown. The language and imagery pioneered by Beidao and his contemporaries is by now the standard language of contemporary Chinese poetry, the norm from which ambitious experimenters try to deviate, but which countless amateur poets on the internet and elsewhere continuously perpetuate. You're still with me? Right, okay. I now want to move to two very famous cases of more recent literary censorship, one from the Jiang Zemin era, 1990 to 2001, and one from the Hu Jintao era, 2002 to 2012, which show how the liberalization of the publishing industry in China and the rise of a bestseller system since the 1990s further complicated censorship practices and outcomes. These two cases are very famous. If you study Chinese literature, you know these cases. The novel Fei Du, or Ruined City, by Jia Pinghua, was published by Beijing Publishing House amidst a great hype in 1993. The scholar Jeremy Barmé has described the building blocks that caused this hype: lavish promotion in the media, rumors that the novel would be full of sex, and that Jia was paid an exorbitant fee by the publisher. And then after it was published and became an instant bestseller, protracted debate in the media and in academic circles about the literary merits and demerits of the novel, including its most famous literary device, the use of empty printed blocks to indicate the number of characters that the author supposedly willingly deleted in order to make sure the sex scenes were not too obscene. I don't think he ever even wrote those words, but he pretended to have. It's a very clever, ironic use of those empty blocks. The use of this device, familiar to Chinese readers from cleansed editions of classic erotic novels such as Jinping Mei, made playful fun of censorship, adding a risque element that would not have been provided by descriptions of sex alone, since that in itself was already no longer a novelty in 1990s China. As Barmé points out, academics and other intellectuals were especially active in the debate, clearly reveling in the fact that for the first time since 1989 they had a public forum again. Predictably, much of the debate revolved around the role of the market in the recently reformed Chinese publishing system. Jia Pinghua was an established author, very much part of the official literary circuit, and even a member of the National Political Consultative Conference. And yet he was selling out, or so it seemed, to the forces of capitalism that the Jiang Zemin regime had created, but was trying to keep away from literature and the arts. On January 20, 1994, the Beijing Municipal Office for News and Publications issued a nationwide order to confiscate all circulating copies of Ruined City. Since the publisher was based in Beijing, it was within the Beijing Municipal Office's jurisdiction to make this decision. It also instructed the publisher to hand over any copies still in stock and to refrain from printing new copies. The publisher was ordered to hand over all profits made, and they were substantial, and to pay a fine equivalent to double the amount of profit. The order points out that all these measures are in line with three relevant legal documents issued in the 1980s. Taken together, these three laws supported the case for considering the book obscene, for a local government to issue a nationwide ban, and for the specific financial penalty to be imposed. Of those three, the first one is referred to in the greatest detail. stipulating the exact clauses of the regulation according to which ruined city could legally be considered obscene and therefore banned. Upon inspection, it appears that these legal clauses are part of obscenity legislation introduced to China in the late 1980s. Like obscenity legislation in other countries, the regulations in question provide some detail as to what type of description of sexual activity counts as obscene. It explains the principle of social harm, linking it especially to potential harm caused to young readers, reminiscent of the Hicklin test, which formed the basis of UK and US obscenity legislation well into the 1950s. These principles are referred to in the banning order of ruined city. Interestingly, the banning order also singles out the device of using empty blocks to indicate words that were removed, stating, in my view correctly, although that doesn't mean I support the censorship, that this was merely a gimmick to attract even more attention to the lewd content. The one thing that the banning order does not explicitly state, even though the relevant legal provisions would have expected it, is whether or not ruined city can be considered to have literary value, since possessing such value would have legally excluded it from the category of obscenity, as we have seen. As always with this type of legislation, as we have seen in our discussion of new censorship theory at the very beginning, the decision to label a work as obscene automatically means withdrawing it from the realm of literature. So none of this affected Jia Binghua personally. He continued to write, he continued to build a career both inside the PRC and abroad, winning several important international literary prizes. Eventually in 2009, 15 years after the original banning, Ruined City was republished in China, the only change being the removal of the empty blocks. As ironies of censorship go, this one is remarkable. By removing blank space, a publication became unbanned. I'm slightly oversimplifying, but I just couldn't resist saying that. An English translation of the work by Howard Goldblatt, which reinstated the empty blocks, appeared in 2016 in the Chinese Literature Today book series, funded in part by a grant from the Chinese government. Gray zone. The case of Ruined City shows anxieties about capitalism, capitalistic exploitation of the literary market, but it also shows a remarkably correct legal process. If the cultural product banned in this way would have been, say, a hardcore pornographic video, the decision would not have raised eyebrows and would not have received international attention. Or to give a somewhat less random example, the later banning of the Chinese translation of 50 Shades of Grey drew very little attention among freedom of speech advocates outside China. We may want to ask ourselves if our objection to censorship in China is really an objection to censorship or an objection to the wrong things being censored. Second case, very famous as well. Yan Lianke's novella 为人民服务, Serve the People, first published in January 2005 and banned soon thereafter, shows how the changes in the domestic and international media and publishing environment played out in a censorship case. Compared to Ruined City, the description of sex in Serve the People is tame. What made the book transgressive was that the novel was set during the Cultural Revolution and that the sex scenes, try to imagine this, the sex scenes featured the use of images of and slogans by Mao Zedong as aphrodisiacs. Furthermore, rather than a playful reference to censorship, as in the case of Jia Binghua's Empty Blocks, Serve the People contains a biting satire of censorship through its ending, when the entire army unit in which the story takes place is dissolved and all traces of its existence are removed as if it were never there, merely in order to cover up the illicit extramarital relationship between a common soldier and the wife of a high-ranking officer. Like Jia Binghua, Yan Lianke was already an established and indeed a prize-winning author prior to writing Serve the People. After he finished the manuscript, he offered it to various literary magazines and eventually found a home for it with the magazine Huacheng, or Flower City, based in Guangdong. According to his own account, the original manuscript was 90,000 words. Prior to offering it to Flower City, he himself cut out 40,000 words to make it less potentially offensive. We have no ways of checking this. And the editors of Flower City cut out another 10,000 before it was published. Nevertheless, when the January 2005 issue of Flower City came out, it was swiftly banned by order of the highest authority, the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party. Although I have not seen the actual document that was sent down from the propaganda department, it was widely cited at the time as containing blanket bans on distributing, reprinting, discussing, excerpting, or reporting on Serve the People. Copies of the magazines already distributed were confiscated. Propaganda departments at all local levels were provided with the rationale for the banning, which was that the work, quote, slandered Mao Zedong, slandered the lofty purpose of Mao Zedong's famous speech, Serve the People, slandered the People's Army, slandered the revolution and politics, as well as that its excessive descriptions of sex confused people's thinking and spread mistaken Western views. News of the banning spread rapidly, mainly through the internet, because we have the internet by now, where copies of different versions of the text quickly began to circulate. Chinese language media in Hong Kong reported on the case, citing the official document from the propaganda department, hyping Serve the People as the first banned book of 2005, and interviewing Yan Lianke himself. In the interview, he explained that he, as an author, was free to write whatever he wanted, but that it was the publishers who needed to be careful and might get punished. He stated that he had not been bothered in any way by the authorities after writing this book, and indeed he later went on to alternate successful prize-winning work with other works that received bans. In a later essay about censorship, Yan repeats his claims about his own freedoms as a writer, but mentions specifically that when Serve the People was banned, the responsible editors at the Flower City magazine and those responsible for publishing the magazine have been fined, dismissed, and punished. For those who insist on studying censorship in the perpetrator versus victim or Godzilla versus Bambi model, it might be instructive to realize that in the PRC these days, the most likely victim of censorship is usually not the author, but rather the publisher. And that this is exactly the same in most Western countries. For instance, in the famous trial of Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl, it was not Ginsberg who was on trial, but his publisher. Again, we see a space here where things connect across a borderline between what is so often presented as a rigidly binary opposition, in this case between authoritarian and democratic systems. I'm not saying they're the same, but I am saying you can study them with the same types of concepts. And nevertheless, the case of Serve the People definitely does show a more authoritarian side of Chinese literary censorship. As in the case of Ruined City, the authorities did have a legal avenue available to them via the country's notoriously strict defamation laws, which, unlike in other countries, forbid defamation of the reputation of individuals who are no longer alive. An argument about defamation of Mao Zedong would almost certainly have resulted in a ban, but perhaps would have taken longer to effectuate, would have been more publicly visible, and would have attracted more people to the novel. Moreover, in view of Mao's status and the significance of his reputation to the overall identity of the CCP leadership, the novella's combination of Mao's image and his famous slogan with descriptions of wanton sexual activity was simply too offensive for the party leadership. It went past their political and their moral bottom line and caused them to use the most effective measure in their arsenal, the immediate ban coming directly from the propaganda department. Although Serve the People was published in English and several other languages not long after its banning, and although it continued to be available for Chinese readers on the internet until at least 2011 and probably longer, it took until 2020 for a full Chinese language edition to appear outside the mainland, published by City University Press in Hong Kong in 2020. Again, with quotes from the banning order printed on the cover as marketing material, as well as the phrase, "a banned novel that shook the mainland." The magazine Flower City still exists. Its website has little descriptions of the contents of every single issue it has ever published. The January 2005 issue is there, but Serve the People is not listed as part of the contents. Ironically, given the novella's satire of censorship's powers of erasure, it has itself been erased, at least in this particular context. On the other hand, the Duxiu database, the country's largest provider of access to digitized books and magazines, does contain a copy of the table of contents of the Flower City issue in question, and Serve the People is listed there, but it does not provide access to the full text. By 2008, Grove Atlantic came out with an English translation of Serve the People, marketing it with the slogan, "Banned in China, the sexy satirical sensation." In its promotional material, the publisher also cited the CCP propaganda department's judgment on the novella, turning the censor's language into advertising language aimed at an implied audience curious to read banned books from China. The translation identifies Yan Lianke as the sole copyright holder of the original text, which means the banning of his work ironically earned him a substantial sum of money. In fact, according to research by Dr. Linda Ng, Yan Lianke was ranked in the top 20 of highest-earning Chinese authors in 2009. An author who was less lucky and was sentenced to jail for publishing obscene fiction is a woman using the pseudonym Tian Yi, known for producing hardcore work in the genre of boys' love, known in Chinese as danmei. Boys' love fiction is extremely popular in online fan communities around the world. Its authorship and readership is predominantly female, and its subject matter focuses on erotic representation of male-male homoerotic relationships. The genre flourished online in China for about a decade, until it came under attack from the authorities as part of a broader effort to curb unhealthy and immoral trends in popular culture. Since then, this type of writing has continued to be popular, but is less prominently advertised on Chinese fiction websites, and the genre category of danmei is typically avoided. What is especially interesting is that this type of Chinese fiction has recently become increasingly popular in English translation among English reading audiences. This is from Amazon. It has happened to me several times in the past year or two that I've come across students at my university who have decided to pursue a major in Chinese because they are fans of translated Chinese boys' love fiction. The case of Tian Yi gained much media attention, which this slide describes to some extent, both inside and outside China, because this author did not limit herself to publishing her work online, but arranged to have it circulated and sold in print, despite not having obtained an official book number. Print publications without a book number are by definition illegal in China. Print publications that are considered obscene and that have made commercial profits are considered a more serious type of illegal publication and receive longer sentences. In the case of Tian Yi's novel titled Gongzhan, which she translated as Occupy, it was established that roughly 7,000 copies were illegally printed and sold, and that a profit of over 150,000 yuan was made. The author herself, as well as the owner and an employee of the printing shop, the cover designer, and the online bookseller were all arrested and all put on trial in November 2018. Based on jurisprudence going back to 1998, which stated that illegal sales of obscene publications in more than 5,000 copies and deriving more than 150,000 yuan in profit should be punished with prison sentences of at least 10 years, the author and the printer were both sentenced to 10 years and 6 months in prison. This immediately became headline news, not only in Western media, slamming the heavy sentence, the violation of the author's human rights, and the assumed underlying homophobia, but also in Chinese media, where the case was openly discussed and many expressed dissatisfaction with the fact that the sentence was based on a law from 20 years ago, when a profit of 150,000 yuan on a book publication was considered a massive amount of money, and when social norms in relation to erotic writing and in relation to homosexuality were very different than they were in China 20 years later. All defendants, except for the print worker who had been given a light sentence, appealed, and the appeal court heard the case 1 month later in December 2018. The Western media had switched off by that time. I can find no follow-up stories in English language news media covering the appeals hearing, even though it was live streamed on Chinese websites and watched by over 2 million people, and widely reported on in the Chinese language media. During the appeals hearing, the prosecutor admitted that procedural mistakes had been made in the original case and recommended that the case be remanded back to the lower court. The judge did not issue a verdict. After that, as far as I can tell, although I'm hoping to find more information, there seems to be silence. It is not clear to me if the appeals court judge agreed to remand the case back to the lower court or if a different verdict was issued. Gray zone. And so we turn to the final part of the story, which is I least enjoy talking about, and that is the overt structural censorship of any kind of nuanced writing about Chinese literature in English language media. I first became aware of this phenomenon in the spring of 2012, when I was still living and working in London, and China was the focus country for that year's London Book Fair, meaning a large delegation of Chinese publishers would be displaying their products at the fair, but also that there would be a substantial cultural program at the fair that would feature a visiting delegation of Chinese writers. As scholars of Chinese literature, my colleagues and I were excited about the prospects of these events. Several of us, including myself, had also advised the book fair on which Chinese writers to invite. Out of the blue, however, what seemed like an orchestrated media campaign in the UK media began to denounce the Chinese writers' delegation as consisting only of state-sponsored hacks. That's a direct quote. Most influential, in my view, most dubious, was an article by the late Jonathan Mirsky, which contained the quote that you see here. Mirsky's views are not entirely without merit, especially when he refers to Gao Xingjian and Liu Xiaobo. This screenshot shows that no works by Gao Xingjian are available in China's largest online bookstore, and this screenshot shows what happens when you search for Liu Xiaobo on a Chinese search engine. The server is being reset. But the suggestion that most of the country's most distinguished writers live abroad and that the delegation that came to London was not worth engaging with was simply untrue. It was an exciting and diverse delegation with representations including the highly and internationally acclaimed modernist poet Xi Chuan, as well as the online celebrity turned best-selling print fiction author Annie Balbei. Oh, and there was also another giant of Chinese literature in the delegation whom I had the pleasure of hosting at my institution for an audience of well over 100 people. That's me there on the right, a younger version of me there. And who a few months later won a certain prize, about which most Chinese literature scholars were truly very excited. But the elite corporate media once again took a completely different line, with destructive tendencies epitomized by the slogan contained in this International Herald Tribune article, "Can great, lasting literature come from there?" Of course, we can have endless debates about the definition of great, lasting literature, but let's just have a look at some numbers from before Mo Yan won the Nobel Prize. This is how many of his titles had already been translated into various European or Western languages before he won the Nobel Prize. He was, in fact, at that moment in time, already the most translated modern Chinese author. Sorry?
Where does he live?
In China. And so he was more frequently translated even than Lu Xun. Despite such evidence and despite the efforts by several scholars, including myself, to set the record straight, the media debate continued and also came to include some renowned Western writers. Salman Rushdie, no stranger to censorship, of course, famously referred to Mo Yan as a patsy of the regime. Of course, Rushdie has a right to his opinion, although I would politely suggest that he should have formulated his opinion after he had actually read some of Mo Yan's work, which he clearly had not. In comparison, Rushdie's own work is widely available in translation in China, except for the one novel that everybody bans. And the same story with Herta Müller, herself winner of the 2009 Nobel Prize for Literature, who called the award for Mo Yan a catastrophe and decried Chinese censorship, obviously without having read Mo Yan's work and without having any detailed knowledge of Chinese censorship. Her own works, of course, are widely available in Chinese translation in China. The double standard is clearly on display here. Two celebrated Western authors who publish work that is entirely uncontroversial in China criticize an author who actually lives and works in China, whose work they have never read, for not being more controversial. In the study of censorship, as mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, we distinguish between institutional censorship and structural censorship. Institutional censorship is what we often see in China, as in the example of my searches for Gao Xinjian and Liu Xiaobo. It is the state-driven restriction of access to specific types of speech. Similarly, the 9 types of speech not protected by the First Amendment of the US Constitution, apologies for not knowing the Canadian Constitution, are also subject to institutional censorship. Structural censorship, like structural racism, is ingrained deeply in how communities function. It is, as Pierre Bourdieu memory put it, an imposition of form that characterizes the shaping of speech in specific social fields, often without its practitioners being aware of it. I suggest that the media-driven imposition of politicized discourse about Chinese literature in the US and more broadly in the Euro-American world is exactly such an imposition. It is a form of transnational censorship that absolves its practitioners from the need to know what they're talking about, and that has increasingly real consequences for those of us who want to resist it without being subjected to political accusations. Here, with some hesitation, I would like to raise an experience I recently had myself. When I submitted a grant application to the National Endowment for the Humanities in the US, setting out my intention to write a book that would contain a nuanced study of literary censorship in 20th century China, one of the anonymous reviewers clearly did not even feel the need to judge my work by humanities scholarship standards, or even by academic standards, and simply said that writing such a book was, and I quote, inappropriate right now because of what is going on in Xinjiang. I have no solution and no hope that this will change anytime soon. I thought I'd throw it out there as a final case example. It has been my explicit intention in this lecture to dazzle you with countless examples of modern Chinese censorship of literature that are all different, that are all complex, that are firmly located in the gray zone, and that we have to study if we want to take this topic seriously. None of what I've said should be construed to suggest that I have any sympathy for the Chinese regime or that I do not oppose the serious violations of human rights that are taking place in China on a daily basis. Everything that I have said should be understood to make the strongest possible case for the study of censorship of literature as having its own complexities that require in-depth study, understanding of nuance, and awareness of the unique characteristics of literary communities and their relation to the state. Only if we are in command of the facts and the details of individual cases can we convincingly launch a critique of the authorities that implement censorship. Reductive approaches to the study of literary censorship in China, just because it happens in China, are to be silenced. Thank you.